lecture is the last in our series that covers parts of chapter 4 in Vankat, and before this, one of those was soils that covered that soils chapter from Gurevich et al. Today, I wanted to talk about mutualisms and commensalisms. As I mentioned in the previous lecture on species interactions, mutualisms really shape the face of the planet. And so they're a little deserving of our understanding. In this, I'll be talking mostly about mycorrhizal relationships, and a little bit about coral reefs and about how plant-plant interactions can be mutualistic as well. So here's a case study from our tropics, and it concerns leafcutter ants. And these leafcutter ants are fungus-growing ants that millions of years ago started cultivating fungi for food. So these little ants are fungi farmers, and they feed their fungi pieces of plant leaves. As these leaves fall to the forest floor, they cut them up into little pieces and they drag them home to their ant nests. In some cases, they will defoliate living plants. In other cases, they simply take the plants that have fallen fresh to the forest floor at the end of the growing season, and as it begins to dry out and plants are losing their leaves. These leafcutter ants, as this says, began farming 50 million years ago. Agriculture on the human scale started about 10,000 years ago. Ants had a little jump on them. And the homes these ants are able to build are phenomenal. So here's an example of these ant nests, and we've got a human up there for scale. These are leafcutter ants. And they burrow out this vast underground subterranean area and create these different compartments of different sizes. And in those, that's where they cultivate their fungi. They're bringing plants down, pieces of leaf down there to grow them. And in the process, they resculpt the above ground part of their environment by taking all that plant material and chopping it up and turning it into fungi that they subsequently eat. And also in the process, they physically change the structure of the soil. So tropical soils, aren't just a big monolith of clay, but they're also chewed up by these huge ant mounds and subterranean cities, just enormous of scale. And of course, this isn't unusual, right? Colonies of these millions and millions of leafcutter ants are all over the place. And so this is a really widespread phenomenon throughout the neotropics. A couple of key concepts that I want you to keep in mind that, as I said, mutualisms and commensalisms that I'll define a little bit, structure the planet, that in positive interactions, neither species is harmed and the benefits are greater than the costs for at least one species. Each partner in a mutualistic interaction acts in ways that serve its own ecological and evolutionary interests. This is important to understand, that each partner is doing this to serve its own interests. And that positive interactions affect the abundances and distributions of populations as well as the structure of ecological communities. Some terms, let's get some terms out for you all to memorize so I can quiz you on them. Yay, quizzes. Symbiosis. This is simply the case of two species that live in close physical contact with each other. So a host and a pathogen, right? So bacterial pneumonia, that's a symbiosis between Pneumococcus bacterium and a human. It could also be mutually beneficial. It just means close physical contact. Facilitation includes mutualism, so that plus relationship that we described in the last lecture. It can also be commensalism. So individuals of one species benefit while individuals of the other species don't benefit but aren't harmed. So it's a win, no big deal relationship. It's like when you hold the door open for somebody, it doesn't hurt you and it benefits them. That's a commensalism. We can have trophic or service mutualisms. We might also think of this as resource versus surface mutualisms. And in our last lecture, I described one of these, and that's plant-pollinator relationships, where a plant is providing a resource or a feeding element, and that's what trophy refers to. Trophic refers to feeding. And the animal is providing a service, and that's it. So a plant-pollinator relationship is an example of a service mutualism. Another thing to think about are mutualisms that might be facultative or obligate. An obligate, you can kind of think of, right? That's obligatory. That the organisms involved require that mutualism, otherwise they die. And corals are an example of this. Corals are obligate mutualists. Without their algae partner, they die. That's an obligate mutualism. Facultative simply means you do better with it. And many plants have facultative relationships with some mycorrhizal fungi. They can grow without it, but they do much better with it. And last, we have direct and indirect mutualisms. And I'm only going to be talking about direct mutualisms here, but this is essentially the case of something like the enemy of my enemy is my friend, where there's an indirect relationship that winds up benefiting both of you. But we're only going to be talking about direct mutualisms here. Another term that's important for us to define as scientists is altruism. And when you and I use the term altruism when we're just hanging out with friends, colloquially, we mean that a behavior that benefits others, which is believed to be selfless, right? So running into a burning building to save somebody is, we think of that as a selfless act, that it's of no benefit to the person doing it, but it helps somebody in distress. We can study, we don't have time to get into the evolutionary biology of the evolution of altruism, but how these traits, like why do humans run into burning buildings or dive into icy waters to save each other, it's clear how that evolves in humans and in other species. This sort of selfless behavior, whether it's a mother bear defending its cub, or elephants or whales mourning over their young. Sorry, I get choked up thinking of some of these examples. Anyway, acts of animals that are believed to be selfless, we refer to those as altruism. Evolutionary biologists define altruism as a behavior of an individual that benefits another at a cost to itself. That's how we define it. That's what altruism is. It's a behavior of an individual that benefits another at a cost to itself. Evolution gives rise to altruism because it enhances the long-term fitness of a population, regardless of the species. Do I have examples? Right, so this bacteria evolved altruistic behavior. Humans evolved altruistic behavior. It happens across the entire kingdom of life. The one I want to talk about first that I'm really excited about are mycorrhizae, that is plant fungus mutualisms. And the particular type of fungi that do this we refer to as mycorrhizal fungi. And a plant may be associated with many mycorrhizal fungi species, different species. And plants provide sugar, right? They provide photosynthate. They make sugar. That's what plants do best. Fungi provide phosphorus, but also water and nitrogen, because fungi are really, really good at getting mineral nutrients off of soil particles, off of rock. And so fungi do that really, really well. And so they are able to produce these things in excess, and they trade them with plants for sugar. And both of these in this relationship have the ability to actually favor like a plant can favor one species of fungus over another. It's quite intricate. And there are a couple of different types I want to talk about. One is ectomycorrhizal fungi. Ecto meaning surface, and these ectomycorrhizae arise when the species of fungi grow these fibers over the coats of plants. Now look at the size comparison between the fungus and the plant. This whole thing we're looking at is a plant root. Right here, this is the tip of a plant root. Each one of these, and look at the size of these cells, these big rectangular things, those are plant cells. These thin filaments are fungal cells. And so the fungal cells are much finer than plant cells. And because they're much finer, they're able to come into closer contact with soil particles and soil solution. And so what they do is they vastly increase the surface area of the soil that they're in contact with. And this is part of what makes them so much better at getting water and nutrients out of soils. And so we refer to these as ectomycorrhizal fungi, the types of fungi that do this. Another type are called arbuscular, and they make these structures inside plant cells called arbuscules. And so what we see on the right side of this is a side of a plant root with all of the different plant cells, and we see the fungus growing outside it. And instead of making a coat around the root tip, it's actually growing down into the plant and proliferating inside certain cells, creating what are called arbuscules. And so all of these, this term hyphae is a filament of a fungus. And so external hyphae are fungus filaments that are external to the plant. And these fungal spores are just how fungi reproduce. So we have these two different, well, there are a bunch of different types. These are two of the most common types. And ectomycorrhizal fungi, to reiterate, are funguses where the fungus grows between root cells and forms a mantle or a coat around the root. Whereas arbuscular mycorrhizae, in those mycorrhizae, the fungus penetrates cell walls of some root cells, forming a branch network inside that cell called an arbuscule. And here we just have examples of how plants do better when they interact with more fungal species. So in each of these graphs, along the bottom here in this horizontal axis are the number of mycorrhizal fungal species with which a plant is interacting in these experiments. And then on the y-axis, we have different variables that were measured. On the top, we have shoot biomass, so the shoot of the plant, right? The stem and the leaves of the plant. And those plants are able to grow bigger when they interact with more mycorrhizal fungi species. There's greater root biomass as well when they interact with more fungal species. And the phosphorus content of the plant is higher. So the concentration of phosphorus in that plant is higher as a result of interacting with more mycorrhizal fungal species. This is a map of mycorrhizal fungal associations, and each color refers to different biomes and different mycorrhizal associations. So ectomycorrhizal fungi tend to dominate forested landscapes. So the boreal forest up there in green, deciduous forests there in blue, and of course way over to the left we've got the diverse Asian northern deciduous forest. We've got this tropical rainforest where ectomycorrhizae are so common, and of course that's the case. I just didn't want to draw arrows all the way over there and obscure the whole figure. We also have arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi, which are common in grasslands. Arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi are very common in tropical forests and in shrublands, and of course in these major grasslands of the world. So grasslands, tropical forests, shrublands, ectomycorrhizal fungi, very, very important in northern forests and temperate forests, and to a lesser extent in tropical forests. And then there's another type that we're not going to talk about. The ericoid mycorrhizae are common, are very common in tundra, and also in things like blueberries and cranberries and the like. But anyway, we're focusing on the ecto and the arbuscular. It's pretty cool anyway. So you can see how these patterns of mycorrhizal associations kind of map onto this map of the biomes that we see down here on the right. So think about that. So these mycorrhizae are key in creating, facilitating, enabling the vegetation that covers most of the terrestrial land surface. Another really important mycorrhizal relationship that's key in the nitrogen cycle are those positive interactions associated with, you guessed it, or you read it, whatever, nitrogen fixing bacteria. I mentioned this before when we talked about the nitrogen cycle, and this is described briefly in your reading. These bacteria are able to break apart that molecular nitrogen that makes up 78% of Earth's atmosphere. And when they do that, they wind up sharing some of that nitrogen with the plant, while the plant gives them sugar. And the plant also gives them an environment in which they can do that. This only happens in specialized plant structures called nodules. So what happens if we go through that process, where's my pointer? We go through that process on the right, these rhizobia, these bacteria attach onto a root hair. They cause the root hair, they excrete chemicals that cause the root hair to grow in this curl. And that grows in a curl and traps these bacteria, and they close them off and start to create an environment that's especially conducive to those bacteria. They then infect the cell, or they infect the plant. They grow into the plant root and proliferate inside some of these interior root cells. And then that causes, from the inside out, then, I don't know why I keep losing my cursor sometimes, sorry. That causes an outgrowth of that infection that creates an airtight environment for those bacterial cells to then grow and proliferate. And it's inside these zones that these nitrogen fixing bacteria can undergo the biochemical pathways that allow them to rip apart molecular nitrogen and liberate it for themselves and for the plant. So the plant grows this structure at a cost to itself, and gets the nitrogen in return. Plants have the capacity to avoid this. Plants won't do this if there's enough nitrogen in the soil, that they don't really need these bacteria to get enough nitrogen. So if you fertilize areas, it inhibits the development of these structures. And we've got this beautiful mountain lupine plant that is just an example of one of these plants that's nitrogen fixing. A different group of species, one group of these bacteria is referred to as in the genus Frankia, and these are nitrogen fixing bacteria that are associated with woody plants, including alder trees and several others. And these are common throughout the world, these tree species, and so they create these. And they do this. This is an example of an alder that's quite common in northern forests and around rivers and streams and the like. And the root, these bacteria cause the plant to grow, again, these sorts of nodules that create an environment, an oxygen-free zone where these bacteria can thrive and perform this amazing interaction. It's the Rhizobium genus that does this with members of the bean family, so like soybeans and peas and clovers and the like, that's seen here in this picture, on the bottom picture. So Frankia and Rhizobium are genera of bacteria that do this. Oh, here we have an example of nice sweet pea that does this, an example of these nodules that form on these plant roots. Briefly, I want to touch on corals because sadly we're not covering corals in this course, but here's just an example of this animal that we refer to as a coral, proving to you that yes, corals have stomachs. And they grow in there, and the bacteria grow inside these tentacles and this the outer part of the tissue of these corals, and they capture sunlight and provide sugar to these corals and allow them to thrive, and it gives them all the different colors that corals do, the different types of algae that live inside them. So with the sun, in warm, nutrient-poor water. Nutrient-poor water is key because if there are too many nutrients, if there's too much pollution in the water, then algae, different kind of algae, grows over the surface of the coral and kills the coral that way. But in the warm, nutrient-poor waters of the tropics, lots of sunshine, that's where these corals flourish throughout the world. Here we've got, the global distribution of corals. At least this is what it was. It's declining rapidly as a function of acidifying oceans and warming sea temperatures. All right, so we have a hypothesis for different types of mutualisms. What conditions should promote these mutualisms? And what we have on the horizontal axis is sort of not dueling, but sort of similar. We'll just focus on the increasing physical stress on the x-axis. So we have low physical stress on one end, and we have high physical stress on the other end. And on the vertical axis, we have low positive interactions and a frequency of high positive interactions. So and the example I'll provide is the case of a very, very stressful environment where plants actually change their habitat and facilitate the growth of each other. So a case of increasing physical stress that leads to habitat amelioration. This happens in the deserts. It happens in the frozen mountain alpine tundra regions as well. Under areas of very low physical stress where things grow really, really well, when things grow well enough, sometimes plants provide associational defenses to each other where they signal to each other when they're getting attacked by enemies, and there are a variety of ways that there are associational defenses. But I want to talk about these areas of high physical stress. And you might remember this hypothesis as a big smiley face. So Reagan Calloway and colleagues tested whether or not positive interactions increased at higher elevations. And so they studied these alpine habitats that were inhabited by small, well above tree line, where conditions were very, very harsh, and asked whether or not plants helped each other. And a really common form of way plants provide positive interactions is actually simply by growing in bunches. When they grow in bunches, they protect each other from harsh, cold winds that dry them out and physically damage them. And we refer to this as a cushion growth form. And so when plants grow in sort of a ball shape or a thick, dense mat, They're actually protecting each other, helping protect each other from the elements by protecting from wind and increasing the temperature inside that clump. Oops. So they studied the effects of neighboring plants of 100 different species that they tested for. So they were looking for they looked for the benefit to neighbors provided by 115 different species in 11 different alpine and subalpine regions. And they measured experimentally the amount of change in biomass or leaf number that was attributed to growing in clumps. And they had a way to quantify this. And they show the results here where in each of these little graphs, I'm looking in the upper left-hand corner, this is the relative neighbor effect. And we have on the y-axis here, 0 means no effect of a neighbor, that there was no effect, either positive or negative. The two categories on the horizontal or x-axis were low elevation and high elevation. And so they evaluated the effect of neighbors at low elevation and at high elevation. And what they found was that in most of the regions they studied, the effect of neighbors was higher in the higher elevation locations. So the more severe the conditions, the more benefit there was to having a neighbor close by. So in most of these cases, the higher elevation site was inhabited by species that benefited from having close neighbors. And that's just what was referred to as that neighborhood amelioration effect. So plants benefiting each other simply by growing in these dense bunches. No plant is an island, as it were. Oh, and that just relates it, that the effect of this was strongest in areas of the lowest summer temperatures. So as summer temperatures increased and conditions were more conducive to growth and less harsh, more benign, as temperatures were warmer, this relative neighbor effect declined, just as the happy face hypothesis suggested. All right, so I just want to close with just a list of a bunch of sort of commensalisms here and mutualisms that we don't even think about. So herbivores and detritivores, such as cattle, sheep, termites, cockroaches, all of these depend on bacteria and protists that live inside their guts and break down cellulose. This is really, really common. Frugivores, that is animals that eat fruits, and pollinators disperse seeds and gametes in exchange for resources. Wait a second. And so commensalism is everywhere. Millions of species form these commensal relationships with organisms, for instance, that provide habitat. Trees, right, in a forest, and kelp in kelp forests in the northern oceans create shade and physical structure. And terrestrial and kelp forests provide that physical structure for animals and other plants. Lichens grow on trees, and lichens are really, really common, especially as you move into northern moist forests. Bacteria live on human skin, right? In a lot of cases, the bacteria on our skin help us and at the very least have no effect on us. And this is commensalism, that all those species that live on us and in us and have no effect, some of them have no effect. Some of us, many of them benefit us, and only very occasionally do they wreak havoc on us. So that's where all right, we're not going to get into the mechanisms of this. You can take my ecology class if you want, or evolutionary biology, and learn more about the evolution of these commensalisms and mutualisms. Anyway, that's where we're going to wrap it up. And the next material we'll cover is covered in chapters 5 and 6 in Vankat. Have a great day.